Welcome to a guide on light infantry in Field of Glory. This will apply to both ancients and medieval. I want to note that we will not be covering evasion or enclosures. These are both covered in earlier guide videos. We'll be dividing this into three parts. The first part being light javelinmen, the second light crossbow, sling, and archers, and the third gunpowder and fire bombs. However, before we get started with that, note on light infantry and maneuverability. So those outside of command and control, getting the reduced CC marker. It's a bit different from standard infantry that simply doesn't get the 45 degrees. That remains the case, but how it pans out is different. So, this unit doesn't have a general, but if it keeps a straight trajectory, it can still turn in any direction, or if it moves one square orthogonally, same thing. Things start to get a little less flexible once you say turn and move a full complement, and then you can't turn anymore. Whereas with a generaled up light javelin unit, you can pretty much do, all kinds of pretty crazy moves and still have some ability to turn. So that seems to have been our limit. Generally, not a huge deal with light infantry, but it does pay to have them in command range. Alright, light javelin men. The vast majority of these are average and unprotected, costing 24 points. So all of these various different models and named units are functionally identical. There are a few other types, not very common, and they really only appear in Ancients as far as I recall. They are the type with some protection and 50% swordsmen, costing 30 or 33 points. There are raw 18-point Nubian light javelin men. And there's the Seleucid Levy skirmishers. They're only 33% javelin, but I categorize them as javelin men for reasons we'll discuss. So first we can talk about the comparison between javelin men and other types of light units. Alright, javelin men are much worse than, say, slingers or archers at this kind of situation of trying to inflict casualties on an oncoming line of heavy foot. Because their range is only one, they're not likely to be able to set up multiple full arc shots and cause cohesion checks, and because they have to get so close, they're quite likely to get caught when charged. You can see my video on evasion if you want to get more details on that. In addition, that range 1 means that they've got much less opportunity to get stationary full arc shots. Most opponents are going to avoid just trundling into these full arc shots, much more difficult to do against the archers or slingers or crossbowmen. Keep in mind, missile fire is never at 100% effectiveness. It's either at minus 20% or plus 20%, based on whether they've moved or turned or not. So stationary arc shooting is 1.5 times effective. It's much, much better, and javelin men generally don't get to use it. If engaging non-light cavalry, particularly on the flanks, an archer in this situation has best move of moving here out of charge arc and then engaging in a close range shot. If for some reason it can't do that, like if there's more nearby enemies, it can at least turn and shoot here and have the decent chance of evading out of the way. Javelin men no such opportunity. To get a full arc shot, has to get in charge range, one tile away, this unit's going to die. It could get around the side, but then it's a half arc. It's not very effective. Other situations where we can compare the two types. Against elephants, javelin men do have to be more careful approaching them. If they come up to the front, they are likely to get trampled by a charge. But if you can get around behind, javelins actually do pretty well against elephants, plus 16% compared to minus 16 for slings and bows. I believe crossbowmen are, just as good as javelins, and the Nafatoon and gunpowder units are quite good. But these are quite rare, and these are quite rare in ancients at least. So if you're fighting elephants and you think the battlefield is going to be spread out enough that you can try to get around like this, javelin men are a good choice. Next up, a fight between javelin men and more longer range light infantry. On the one hand, The missile fire is fairly similar, and impact is great for Javelinmen. But the enemy's just going to invade at this range, so if you keep charging, they'll just keep turning back around and shooting at you as you disrupt. If you move into missile range to shoot first, well, you're going to have trouble setting up multiple full arcs because of the range 1, and the enemy in their next turn is simply going to move back 1 tile, turn and shoot. So you'll perpetually be having to move and shoot and be unable to charge. It's not terrible in the sense that these units are cheap, but still. It's not all bad. Forest fighting. This is where light javelinmen excel. So, archers, slingers, crossbowmen. It doesn't matter that they have range shoot; they can't see, right? So in this kind of situation, the missile power is equal, despite javelinmen being much cheaper. And if it comes down to a melee, right, because the archers can't move back and turn and shoot, they have to either commit to shooting and accepting the chance of getting charged with light spear plus 100, or move back and not engage. That said, against dedicated medium foot, the fact that the medium foot are moderately disordered does not begin to make up for the fact that medium foot have melee capabilities and also have combat strength modifier in their favor by being much larger units. Another point of comparison is when engaging light cavalry in open terrain. So your bog standard light javelin horse, these have light spear impact. They also get plus 100 mounted versus light foot in open terrain. It's a pretty chunky win chance in the open, but against light javelinmen, it's plus 50, which is not nothing, but it's comparatively modest. And then against, Yuzunoi, the melee odds are very heavily stacked in favor of the light foot. So light horse archers can charge light archers just fine, even if they don't have light spear. But against light javelinmen, it's kind of a wash and not worth it. Light lancers, any light foot has to look out for. The impact is extremely powerful. In melee, the Yuzunoi will win thanks to combat strength, combined with their 50% swordsmen, but that's not a common matchup. Other ways to use light javelinmen, though. For one thing, most lists are going to have some mixed combination of the two. And here you have a cheaper light infantry line with some light javelinmen mixed in. And this can do okay, actually, because the threat of the charge of the light javelinmen can impose some dilemmas where the light archers have to choose, do I want to pull back and shoot at the light javs, but as a result, not be able to retaliate against the light archers? Do I want to stand against stationary arc shooting, but if I don't disrupt that, I can get charged? While the red player in this case can still set up full arc shooting, thanks to their force being mostly light archers. A sort of situation that's not too common, but it does happen sometimes, is where you have a overall melee focus list pushing a ranged foot list. So in this case, your light infantry, even if they were better light infantry, are not going to win this firefight, right? It's just not happening. But they can, be arrow sponges in front of the heavy foot to allow the heavy foot to get into contact undisrupted. This is not cheap in terms of points, but it can make sense. You might say, well, why would I get these 6 light jabs instead of 3 more hoplites? Well, that's not necessarily wrong, but it could lead to situations where your hoplites are disrupted before contact and it spreads panic, as opposed to your light javelinmen are disrupted, and you'll mostly be able to pull them out before they get auto-broken. And then you'll peel them off right before you charge, and then you have an intact line of hoplites and a ragged, badly shot up, but still kind of usable force of light javelinmen for elsewhere. If you are engaging non-light foot, javelinmen excel. This only happens in non-open, of course, but for example, masked archers you can disrupt quite handily. If you were having to charge, say, these Hebrew foot head-on, well, the light spear of the javelinmen would allow them to land impact even if their fallback wasn't blocked, whereas light archers are probably going to bounce. So if you could charge in and they can have an auto drop set up by a non-light unit, that can work quite nicely. Now, despite the 50% swordsmen, this is going to get wrecked by combat strength modifier. In terms of enemy units that are disordered, well, despite that disorder, like, even with the Uzunoi that are the best melee light infantry, even if you win impact, it doesn't really matter. The hoplites will be the same disrupted as they are moderately disordered. Armored cavalry will probably evade, which is nice, but it's not huge. You pay quite a bit for these melee capabilities for the Uzunoi. They cost 33 points, and there's going to be rare situations where you can use it, but a lot of the time they're just going to get bogged down fighting archers, in which case you might as well have the much cheaper light javelin men. Next. So, light javelin men are vulnerable to cavalry, but if you can zone the cavalry with some foot instead, you can start getting stationary shooting down on them. This kind of situation can happen a fair amount where lancers or chariots will be used to lock down the movement of a large force of infantry. Well, if you have some light javelin men, perhaps you could either pelt them from all sides or block their fallback. General if this unit may be in charge to tank the impact and hopefully pass it while the rest of your units push on. I mentioned that we'd be discussing the levy skirmishers and why I categorize them as javelin men. So they're only 1/3 javelin men, but regardless of what range they shoot at, all their ammo is depleted. So at long range, you're wasting javelins and sling stones for half effective bow shot. At range 2, you'll occasionally do this because you might need to try to cause a check, but it is a waste because the javelins don't get counted and the ammo gets wasted. So these are effectively not very good javelin men. They are also unmaneuverable. So they'll still get a full free turn as Lightfoot. They will not get a free 45-degree turn when in command range like all other Lightfoot in both games. This is a pretty rare unit. The sleeve kits just get a few of them anyway. So overall, light javelin men are simply not as good as the range 2 units, unless they are doing forest work. But the fact that they're so cheap does make them worth their cost. They're pretty effective when mixed in with other missile units, or if you just need some kind of screen for your infantry to push into contact. So they do not shine in the center of the battle line. They do best on the flanks in terrain. And, if you have a choice, slingers are generally going to be better. But often you don't have a choice. You need some Lightfoot, and you can make use of them. Just be prepared that they're going to be more useful to slow down the enemy and cause confusion than actually inflicting a lot of damage or cohesion checks outside of ideal situations. So next, archers, slingers, and crossbowmen. In terms of POAs, there's bow, longbow, sling, and crossbow. We'll go over some of the basics of these differences, but you can look up the POA charts easy enough in the manual. Ancients also has a superior varieties of sling and bow. They basically will take checks better, they shoot better, and they have 50 melee and impact POA, but they're much more expensive and they'll die just the same to missile fire themselves, being unprotected. Alright, so these overall types. Well, archers and slingers are basically identical at close range shooting, and archers also get half effective long range shooting. So close range against unprotected Lightfoot, 12 to 40. Longbowmen, also 12 to 40. Right, their advantage is a little bit of armor penetration. Crossbowmen are a horrible 6 to 22, as opposed to against these dismounted men at arms. Right, we have 0 to 6 or 6 to 24. Against mounted, it's not so extreme. 4 to 16 versus 6 to 22. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, light archers and slingers are going to be very effective for fighting enemy skirmishers and shooting at less well protected troops, especially cavalry. Crossbowmen suck at actually winning the skirmish against enemy line infantry. You don't want to use them for that, they're not going to be good at it. Instead, you'll generally want to deploy them to the wings, often supporting your own cavalry or utilizing terrain, to shoot down enemy cavalry, particularly, men at arms, knights, that sort of thing. We went over this in the section on light infantry, but yes, slingers and archers can move out of charge arc and still get shots off quite easily. Some basic formations, well, they might escort a slower force of knights by screening them from horse archers. They get charged, knights can countercharge. They might work in tandem with 50% bow or horse archer types and add their firepower to cause disrupts and then evade to safety. Or, if the advance is along a forest, they can escort from the side. I went over this pretty thoroughly in the enclosures video, but they are very safe in enclosures from cavalry impact. More detail in the separate video. In addition, being in difficult slope or deep stream or forest, they are steady, whereas massed archers are moderately disordered, which means their shooting is not as good, so it's really not a great place to put them unless you are desperate for their safety. Another sort of conventional deployment, if you have a patch of rough on one side and the enemy is mostly mounted, you can fill it with light archers. Against foot, this won't really slow them down much. You can use them to screen a line of foot, or more cheaply intermix light javelinmen, as we saw in the last section. Okay, otherwise, in terms of various combat situations, we covered a lot of that in the section on light javelinmen, but I do want to talk about long range shooting, when to do it, when not to do it. Alright, so 90% of the time that you could shoot at long range with archers or crossbowmen, specifically light archers or crossbowmen, you should not do it. It's unlikely to do much, and it's going to burn your ammo. Don't do it. Wait a turn, maneuver into a situation where you can get close shooting to cause real casualties and real cohesion checks. That said, there are exceptions. There are situations where you might do the less than half as effective shooting. Okay. One situation is where the target's already been shot up, and one more shot will either cause a cohesion check, or you think one more shot will add an additional -1 to the missile fire cohesion test. In that case, it can be worth it if you can't safely maneuver into close range. Another situation will be if you think one more shot or two more shots, whatever, might be able to cause a unit to auto break. Okay, fair enough. Another situation will be if the enemy is rapidly advancing to melee contact with your whole line, and you think that you're not going to have time to shoot off your ammo before the battle's peaking. I don't think that's likely. You can usually shift them elsewhere to do something, but it's possible. Another will be the game's about to end, either because one side is about to win or the timer is about to run down. In which case, if you can't get into close range, you might as well shoot anyway. And finally, and ironically, if you are at low ammo and you can't maneuver in close, well, low ammo doesn't run out. I think it should, but it doesn't. So in that case, you might as well plink away. This situation is a little bit different though with guns. Okay, so for gunpowder, there's, handgunners of various sorts, and the Nafatun, who have bombs. Handgunners are functionally very similar. Some are unprotected and average, some are unprotected and above average, and some are protected and average. It's all functionally pretty similar. If I had to pick one, I'd probably take the above average Janissary handgunners for their better shooting. The difference between gun and bomb is that the guns can shoot long range at 2 tiles, and the bombs are better at targeting cavalry. So 8 to 30 versus 14 to 44. As a result, they both cost, well, these are protected, so they're 36. These are 36 as well. The unprotected are 30. The Janissary are 35. Alright. Against elephants, these units are quite effective. So standard is 0 to 2. I think crossbowmen and javelins are both at the plus 16%. So these are at plus 33. Doesn't show the casualties number differently, but there is rounding involved, so they are better. More importantly, they ignore armor. So, 18 to 58. As you recall, none of the traditional missile weapons were causing casualties like that. And finally, probably most critically for using these units effectively is that they cause a additional -1 to range CT check for the turn, even if by firing on the enemy they do not themselves cause a single casualty. Pulling up the combat log, we'll take a shot, see if they pass. Alright, total modifier is +1. Now, regardless of whether we shoot with this super effective close range blast or long range half effect without even turning, shot at by artillery, bombs, or handguns, shooting at, some combination, then will still be -1. It doesn't stack. But still, right? You can see how powerful that is when used in concert with other missile weapons. So even if you run low on ammo, you can keep inflicting that -1. What these units are not good at and really are wasted on is fighting other light infantry. If they're fighting archers, they're shooting at half effect at long range, so they have to move up close. The archers can keep, falling back and turning and shooting, and these units are more expensive in this case. It's a waste, and frankly, you don't tend to get very many of them in any lists. Against Javelinmen, they are at risk of being charged with a light spear impact, and the Javelinmen are 24 points. This is a horrible misuse of these units. So instead, you kind of want to use them as much as possible as like specialty hit squads against expensive units that are otherwise difficult to bring down by shooting. Armored foot, armored cavalry, superior units to cause that -1 CT. And as much as possible, you're going to use them like Javelinmen, trying to maneuver to flanks. You can shoot at range 1, or zone the enemy out with a non-light and then blast them with handgunners. This is a great way to take care of, say, pike Kyle units. Zone them with cavalry to the front, lock them down, and pour on gunfire. The range 2 shooting is not great, but couple it with archery and the -1, and it can be worth it. Nafatoon are a very rare unit. They're generally present in lists that are before the true gunpowder era, and the bombs are usually probably fire bombs, not gunpowder. So they, generally one or two of them appear in a list, and you'll want to use them to target cavalry, elephants, things like that. So these units are very good, but kind of like light crossbowmen, they are not good at fighting other skirmishers, and shooting at cheap units with them is also a waste. You want them hitting heavy hitters, even more so than the crossbowmen, who at least can, target other cavalry in a points efficient manner. These guys, you'll use them as skirmishers if you need to, but that's not what you should be using them for. Alright, and that concludes this guide on light infantry. Like I said before, I try to keep these pretty brief to have them be digestible. There's a lot more detail I could go into about, all three sections we covered here. But in short, archers and slingers are your jack of all trades, able to engage pretty much anyone and do a decent job, except maybe very heavily armored foot. Crossbowmen, light crossbowmen, are good for fighting cavalry and armored foot, but are wasted fighting skirmishers. Pretty similar deal with guns and bombs. In addition, that -1 CT they inflict is really useful. And Javelinmen excel in forest work, and well, they're cheap, and you need something cheap. And there they are. Things that I talked about in the other videos were invasion and enclosures, and no doubt I could say more about terrain relating to Lightfoot, but I'm planning on more detailed overall terrain videos in future. So let me know below if you have any questions. Otherwise, until next time.